So I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wattamatagal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since Dreamtime. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. So I will now hand over to Professor Hsu-Ming, who will introduce us to our speaker, Dr. Stephanie Russo, and there will be some time for questions and discussion later in the seminar. And you should also know that, as usual, you will be out within the hour, so you will be out by 5 o'clock. Okay, over to you, Hsu-Ming.
Okay, thanks very much, Bridget. So it's my very, very great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Stephanie Russo, who is, of course, the Discipline Chair of Literature in MCCALL. So Stephanie specializes in historical fiction and early modern and 18th century women's writing. Her work has focused on exploring representations of politics, monarchy, power, fashion, gender, sex, and revolution. She's got a particular interest in women's historical fiction of the 20th and 21st centuries and has commenced a work on a project about the use of anachronism in historical fiction, including film and television. Now, Steph is a prolific and outstanding researcher. Last year, she won the Faculty of Arts Research Excellence Prize for Outstanding Research Achievements, specifically for 33 publications in 3 years, including her monograph, The Afterlife of Anne Boleyn, which we are, of course, focusing on today. So this monograph was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020, and it explores the ways in which Anne Boleyn has figured as a symbol of a whole range of ideas about sex, history, politics, gender, religion, and power for half a millennium. That's right, for nearly 500 years, since the 16th century, a plethora of poetry, plays, polemical pieces, biographies, dramas, short stories, novels, fan fiction, film and television series, and now websites have been devoted to narrating the different aspects of the Anne Boleyn story, testifying to its enduring fascination and significance in popular culture. The monograph comprehensively and exhaustively examines these representations, and Steph has a simple but profoundly persuasive argument running through the book, namely that Anne Boleyn is an essentially unknowable figure who is used by different writers as a focal point to explore various and changing political, religious, social, gender, and sexual concerns. I just want to begin, before I hand over to asking Steph questions, I just want to read you the first paragraph for this book, because if this doesn't persuade you to read the book, I don't know what will. Okay, so first chapter, The It Girl of Tudor England. Almost everybody knows something about Anne Boleyn or thinks that they do. She was the motivation behind Henry VIII's break from the Church of Rome. She enthralled the king so deeply that he was prepared to wait for years to make her his queen or to get her into his bed. She slept with her brother. She slept with hundreds of men. She was asexual. She was a witch. She was sexually irresistible. She would do anything for power. She was a martyr. She was a sinner. She was a sexual harassment victim. She was the original femme fatale. She was a proto-feminist icon. There are as many Anne Boleyns as there are tellers of her story. So we know that there are lots and lots of Anne Boleyns, but maybe you could begin, Steph, by telling us about the historical Anne Boleyn. Who was she? What historical facts do we know about her?
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Hsu-Ming, and your spirited reading, which makes it sound way more exciting than I anticipated. So Anne Boleyn is of course the second wife of Henry VIII, the first one to get the head chopped off, and the woman who supposedly precipitated the English Reformation. In terms of what we know about the historical Anne, we know a lot of details and we don't know a lot of details. So we know a lot of facts about, where she was, what she was doing, what people have said about her, etc. But there are also huge gaps in her story. I mean, there are factual gaps. We don't know even when she was born, and people still argue about what year she was born, 1501, 1507, some date in between. But the bigger kind of gap is any kind of sense of her motivations or what she felt about everything that happened to her, really. I mean, you can kind of assume what she felt about her execution, but we don't know, you know, did she love Henry? Did she scheme to get Henry? Did she find Henry annoying? You know, was she sexually harassed by Henry? We don't, yeah, we don't have any sense of, I think, the woman behind the mythology. And I think that's why we have such a wealth of historical fiction, because historical fiction loves to find the gaps in the historical record and use the imagination to fill those gaps. We do have some of her letters, but they're not really personal letters. They're not confessional letters. They're more in the sense of business letters. We do have Henry VIII's love letters to her, but we don't have her responses. So in a sense, we are reading from the gaps. We are reading from absence in sort of figuring out or trying to kind of account for a sense of her personality. But we really don't, I mean, people think they know a lot about her, but we don't really have anything concrete upon which to base those observations. Even those people that did leave an account of her in her lifetime, their accounts are shaded by politics and what sort of side they're on, so to speak. So what we don't know about Anne Boleyn, I think, is more significant than what we do know, even if, you know, we can say she was here on this day, she was doing this on this day. I think that she is still a very enigmatic figure.
Okay. Yes, and I mean, this started very early on during her lifetime and immediately after her death. So when did the first literary representations of her actually begin, and for what purpose?
Well, as you say, in her lifetime. So she appears in Thomas Wyatt's poetry. So Sir Thomas Wyatt is the great kind of Tudor poet, the first great Tudor poet of his generation, and he writes sonnets. He writes sort of adaptations of Petrarchan sonnets. And he knew Anne. Some people would say that he was in love with Anne. Of course, we cannot know that he was in love with Anne, but certainly that has been the kind of romantic speculation. So he writes a bunch of sonnets that have been interpreted as referring to Anne. I think the clearest example is a sonnet called Whoso Lists to Hunt, which seems to be about Anne. And what he's doing with Anne is he's representing her as a courtly mistress. So she is the kind of forever unreachable courtly mistress. And the point of courtly love is not to act upon that love. It's not to fulfill the love. It is for the courtly lady to be forever out of reach. It is a rhetoric of non-consummation. And so she is forever out of reach. She's forever desirable, but she's elusive and she's dangerous. So in Whoso Lists to Hunt, the whole point of that poem is to really stress that she belongs to a more powerful man. So that's why it's so easy to read Anne into that poem, because the more powerful man, the Caesar of the poem, seems to be quite clearly Henry VIII. So the speaker of Wyatt's poem is searching for this elusive hind, this deer, who he can never have because she belongs to another man. So we already see her becoming part of literature in her own lifetime. We also get other potential references to her in other poetry. We get potential references to her execution. Again, it's not quite clear if that's what he's actually talking about. And then after her death, we start to see her represented in a few other kind of poems and so forth. But it's a bit politically dangerous to represent her directly after her death for obvious reasons. Henry VIII wasn't keen on people talking about the wife he'd just executed. So she sort of doesn't really appear in a lot of literature for a period of time, really until Elizabeth takes up the throne.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about her representation during her daughter Elizabeth's reign then.
Well, there starts to be a sort of spate of poetry in which Anne Boleyn appears. So there's poems by two poets that I'm particularly thinking of, one called Ulpian Fulwell and one called Christopher Auckland. And they basically flatter Anne as a way of getting patronage from Elizabeth. So it's a very good way to suck up to the Queen, is to say, hey, your mother was great. We'll just skip sort of lightly over the fact that your father killed her, but they represent her as this kind of saintly figure. And of course, this is the time when Protestantism is really becoming entrenched in English society as a sort of state religion. And so people celebrate her role in bringing Protestantism to England, because she is supposedly the woman who inspired this movement, this schism, people really latch on to that idea of her bringing rational Protestantism to England, saving England from Catholic superstition. And so that's the tenor of a lot of writing in Elizabeth's time. Look what you did. You gave birth to the wonderful, the glorious Elizabeth, and now she has brought Protestantism and this golden age for England, and you were the mother of this golden age. So you can see there that she's being used as sort of a political tool. There is a propaganda element. There is a, you know, obvious patronage element going on here.
So first she's a figure of romance, and she figures in romance, and then she's used for religious purposes during the Reformation. Can you tell us more about the kinds of stories that get told about her then during the Reformation? Because we've forgotten a lot of that now. Yeah, so we do, because we don't really talk, or recent adaptations don't really play up the religious aspect of the story, because obviously the sex element sells better. But in terms of stories about her in the Reformation, the kinds of stories that Protestant writers like to tell about her was that one motif that often comes up in sort of Protestant writing, which is a good way of kind of excusing her earlier actions, is that they argue that she sort of reforms after she becomes queen. She becomes serious. She realizes the magnitude of her role, and she becomes kind of more scholarly. She tells her ladies in waiting, that they mustn't flirt with men, but that they should, spend time reading the Bible. And reading the Bible in English, because the vernacular Bible was a huge issue, obviously, for the first tranche of Protestantism. So we get that focus on her being really kind of devout, quiet, which is, again, really not what we see with the kind of modern Anne Boleyn. Other stories are that she gave Henry literature related to religious reform, and that he was inspired by this literature to, throw off the shackles of the Pope and to form the English church. So there is this real emphasis on her religiosity and her influence, and that's really a way that historical women have been able to enter into the history books, is through this idea of influence, that they have this influence over the men in their lives. And so that is a very kind of convenient way to talk about Anne Boleyn as having an influence in Henry VIII's embrace of Protestantism, because he actually never really embraced Protestantism. He was always very Catholic, but it suited him to get rid of the Pope for various reasons. Yeah. Okay, and these representations so far are overwhelmingly written by men, but it's in the 18th century that women start to write about Anne Boleyn. So tell us why 18th century novels about Anne Boleyn were so important for women's history and women's writing.
Okay, so in the 18th century, women started writing about Anne, and I think there's a few things going on there. One was that women were increasingly writing history. So you started to get women writing usually biographies of queens or other kind of legendary figures, or, really popular, powerful figures in English history. They weren't writing about, the next door neighbour. They were writing about famous women. So the rise of women's history, I think, is important here, but also in terms of women's novels, they were able to use the I and the first person narration in order to imaginatively get into Anne Boleyn's head. And all of the literature before the 18th century, it was either poetry or drama. There wasn't really a means. So Anne Boleyn was sort of like a character on the stage. There wasn't really a means of entering into her consciousness until the novel. And so then women started to write novels. Women were overwhelmingly readers and writers of novels throughout the 18th century. It was considered, a feminine form, a women's form. And so people started to dramatize Anne Boleyn's experience. And the one that I'm particularly interested in, which I always sort of talk about when I get the opportunity, is Sarah Fielding. So Sarah Fielding was the sister of the famous 18th century novelist Henry Fielding. And she actually just writes a chapter of a book that was otherwise written by her brother. So she inserts a chapter. And it's the book is called Journey from This World to the Next. And in it, the narrator, or the main character, he goes to the underworld, right? And he talks to various famous dead people. And one of the dead people that he encounters is Anne Boleyn. And so she's able to give a first-hand account from beyond the grave of her life. And this is a fantasy that's sort of taken up by a lot of writers. Like, what if you could go meet the ghost of Anne Boleyn and talk to her about how she felt? We still see this happening in novels today. And what Sarah Fielding does is she uses Anne Boleyn's story to think about all sorts of issues that women faced, like the patriarchal marriage market, right? How do you find a good husband? The ways in which women are treated by men. So Anne Boleyn spends a lot of time saying, well, men, in my experience, have always let me down. What am I going to do about that? I have no power in this world. So actually what I'm going to do is use my sexuality, my charm, my charisma, all of these sort of legendary facets of her character in order to get along, right? She had no power. She had no access to power. So she was going to use what she had in order to gain some sense of power. So it's really a meditation of like where women are in the world and how they experience and move through the world. And it's being done through the lens of Anne Boleyn. And in a sense, it sounds, you know, the comparison I always make is it sounds like a Jane Austen novel, really, because she's quite witty, she's quite cynical in a way. So you see that sense that Anne Boleyn was a kind of lens through which women could think about aspects of their own experience and tie Anne Boleyn's experience in the 16th century to an 18th century woman's experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what happens to her in the 19th century then? How do the 19th century representations of Anne Boleyn speak to the preoccupations of the age?
Well, the 19th century got very strange. So there was this huge proliferation of fiction about Anne. And there are different strands of where she sort of ends up. So she ends up in a lot of novels. She also becomes a character in Gothic novels. And these are Gothic novels where the story of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII is kind of accompanied by various supernatural elements. So it'll be seen to be like a normal historical novel, a realist historical novel. And then all of a sudden there's a ghost or Herne the Hunter, which is this sort of demonic figure, or there's mystical love apples, and so forth. So she becomes the center of a kind of Gothic tale. And that's because there are already inherent kind of Gothic elements to her story: violence, execution, sex, etc. So there's already imprisonment at the Tower. There are already Gothic elements to her story. So you can see how that she would be in a kind of appropriate model for a Gothic novel. But you also see the return of religion. So in the 18th century, the women writers didn't really focus on religion as much. They were quite secular takes on Anne Boleyn's story. But in the 19th century, you get a real return to a religiously inflected representation of Anne. So you get a lot of Protestant writers, again, writing plays usually, not very well produced plays, as in some of them don't seem to have been produced at all. They might have been closet dramas or, just produced sort of locally. But you do get this spate of dramas in which she's, again, a Protestant martyr. She's, very pure. She has no agency whatsoever. She's just a victim of Henry. She doesn't really make any decisions. She's just sort of buffeted about by chance. And then she ends up, martyred, and really is self-consciously martyred. Like she knows that she's becoming a Protestant martyr. So you do get that return to religion. And you also get really weird stuff. So in the 19th century, late 19th century, there's a really strange novel called Cold Steel by M.P. Shiel. And in that novel, she is completely demonic. She's an evil character. She has this frizzy blonde hair. And of course, know that Anne Boleyn was a brunette. That becomes part of her kind of established character. But in this novel, she is this demonic figure who sort of rampages around England and is attempting to actually force another woman to be sexually assaulted by Henry, because her reasoning is that Henry is now entranced by this woman. And if she sets up her rape, he will basically get over it because he will have extinguished his lust. And so it's quite a really weird and disturbing portrayal of Anne Boleyn. And I mean, it's completely unreadable, but it's like the most complicated novel that you'll ever read. But what's also interesting about that novel is that the reason why Anne is a problem in that novel is because she brought about the modern world, basically. So he's trafficking in kind of understanding of the medieval that has come up again in the modern world, where the medieval is understood to be this white paradise, right? Where there was no racial mingling, right? And she brought about the modern world through the Reformation. And that meant that, races started to mingle in England, Black people started to mingle in England, Jewish people started to mingle in England. And he was very upset about that. And he blamed Anne, basically. So Anne became the person who had brought the modern world into being, and therefore she was a problem.
Sounds like a Tudor Bridgerton.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so, then what happens, I think, in the 20th century as society becomes more secularized is in many ways a reversal of a trend that happened between the 16th and 17th century. In the 16th to 17th century, we go from romance to religion, right, in terms of representation, but we seem to be going from religion back to romance in the 20th century, between the 19th and 20th century. But it's a romance which is very different from the 16th century in that narrative in the 16th century was controlled by men. Romance in the 20th century is a genre that is controlled by women. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so you get Anne Boleyn's story becomes so much the province of women that it's really hard, actually. I don't think that I deal with any text written by men after, say, 1947 or something like that. It becomes exclusively the province of women's writing. And you do get that move to a more kind of romance novel trope, or a romance novel style in terms of depictions of her stories. So you get, the stripping out of religion again. You get a lot of emphasis on Anne's emotional life. And you also get the assumption, which is repeated kind of ad nauseum throughout the 20th century, that Anne doesn't love Henry, right? They're very firm on that. She didn't love Henry, but what she was doing is she was motivated by ambition. And the ambition is usually tied to two things. One is ambition for power, and two is revenge. And the reason that she wants revenge is because she's actually been separated by her true love. And her true love, which is this man, is imagined to be, we don't know if she actually loved him or not, but it's imagined to be this man that she was entangled with or betrothed to in her youth before she gained the interest of Henry, called Henry Percy. And so these novels will postulate that she really loved Henry Percy. She wasn't allowed to marry Henry Percy, and usually Cardinal Wolsey, who was Henry's Lord Chancellor, or Henry himself, separated her from her true love. And because the 20th century romance novel is so invested in this idea of true love, the fact that she is torn from her true love is a problem. So then she turns to a kind of business-like arrangement in her marriage, the marriage for ambition, the marriage for power, the marriage for money. And again, because there is such an emphasis on love being really important in the 20th century novel, that is the cause of all her problems, because she doesn't have love. She only has power. She only has ambition. And of course, the woman who doesn't have true love is destined to be forever unsatisfied. And so that is the reason basically her marriage falls apart, because she's gone into her marriage for the wrong reasons. And she learns that ambition can only take you so far, and that ambition, will blow up, really, especially for women. So that becomes, again, really reiterated over and over again in historical novels. I cannot tell you how many novels that I read which basically hit all of those same beats about ambition, about the lack of love, about the fact that her problem was that she didn't have true love.
Okay, so for those of you who noticed that Steph and I are now sitting in the dark, we are now in the Gothic mode, right?
There we go, some lights.
The Gothic mode of Anne's story. Okay, so we've moved from a situation where in the 16th and 17th centuries, her narrative is controlled by men, to the mid-20th century where it's predominantly women who are controlling and producing narratives about her. So inevitably then second wave feminist concerns become integrated into the representation of her. So tell us more about that.
Well, second wave feminism makes a distinct difference in stories about Anne, but they sort of go in two strands. So the first strand would be the idea that we still see repeated and replicated, that Anne was a feminist ancestor, that she was a forerunner of today's feminists, that she believed in women's rights, in women's education, that she was incredibly educated, which she was. We know that she was very well educated, but people give her, speeches and beliefs that we would now identify as feminist, as distinctly feminist. And that, I don't think Jean Plaidy is the first one, but Jean Plaidy's Murder Most Royal does that. She thinks about, for example, the fact that it's really stupid that women can't become rulers of a nation. Why can't my daughter become the monarch, etc. So we see that emphasis on her kind of proto-feminism. But then we also see a parallel strand which is that Anne is a cautionary tale. And this, I think, is about a backlash to feminism, because she basically becomes the career woman who's gone too far. And this is tied again to that idea that she's married for ambition rather than for love. So because she's done that, she has prevented her from having this kind of affectionate companionate marriage. And she has chosen the public sphere. She's chosen the world of politics. She's chosen the world of power plays. And this is a dangerous world, and she's not suited for it because she's a woman. And she's basically gone too far, and she's abandoned her kind of womanly calling. So the way this plays out a lot is in novels about her sister Mary. So when Philippa Gregory writes The Other Boleyn Girl, she sort of launches herself into the world and says, nobody has ever remembered that Mary Boleyn existed. I'm the first person to do this. That's not true. There's about 4 or 5 novels that are basically the same as The Other Boleyn Girl. And they all play out the central story of Anne Boleyn is wrong because she's the kind of femme fatale temptress woman who just wants power and is going to use sex to get power. So she falls because she basically has turned her back on her feminine nature and become masculine in her pursuit of power. Whereas Mary Boleyn is the successful one. She's blonde, she's pretty, she's compliant, she doesn't rock the boat, she doesn't get involved in politics, she becomes Henry's mistress because she kind of has to, or because she just really likes sex, which is posited by many of these novels. And she is successful because she really values her role, her feminine role. She values being a mother, she values the domestic, she just wants to kind of live quietly with the man that she loves, and therefore she's successful. So Anne becomes the feminist cautionary tale, you know, that discourse around, like, you know, if you choose career over family, you'll live to regret it. And that's that's precisely what happens to Anne. Obviously, live to regret it involves being executed rather than just, you know, not having children. But we see that kind of same discourse play out in these novels.
Yeah, that's a sort of third wave post-feminist backlash to the second wave feminist representations of her, right, where she's really presented as a victim, right? And as you say, punished for going after what she wants. I think like the last quarter or third of the book, which is, you know, where you discuss the transition from second wave feminism to third wave feminism and post-feminism, for me is really, really riveting stuff. So tell us more about this transition then, where she makes the transition from victim to agent, but in very, very limited ways.
Yeah, so I think that what happens in that move to a kind of third wave feminist Anne is we get an expansion of what Anne could be, and again that's tied up with power and agency versus inaction and lack of agency. So we do have her having a sense of agency. We also get sex re-enter the story. So instead of her being asexual or not interested in sex with Henry or just motivated by ambition, we get a kind of sexy Anne Boleyn sort of comes back. There's a story, a time slip story actually, that kind of encapsulates that move from second to third wave feminism very nicely. It's a bit of a parody actually of second wave feminism. So it's a story called A Rose with All Its Thorns by Lillian Stewart Carl. And what happens in that is that it's a story about a modern academic, right? And so this modern academic is a very sort of caricatured second wave feminist. And she's going to a history conference and she's going to talk about, you know, how Anne Boleyn was this victim. And she's the kind of sort of parody of a second wave feminist where she doesn't like the word seminal because it's got semen in it. So she wants to use ovular, right? So she's this parody second wave feminist person. And then through a complicated series of events, the spirit of Anne Boleyn time slips into her body. And this woman's thesis was all about the fact that, you know, people are so sexist about Anne Boleyn. She wasn't this sexy woman. She was a victim. She didn't want sex with Henry. She never did anything wrong. She's this martyr. And then when she's embodied by the spirit of Anne Boleyn, she finds actually she's very sexually forward. She likes to flirt with all of the men. She likes to look good. She likes to, and she admits, yes, I used my body to get what I wanted. What's wrong with that? And she challenges this feminist academic's view of Anne Boleyn. And it becomes a kind of allegorical way, or sort of a sort of parody of thinking about that move from the second wave to the third wave Anne. So the third wave Anne is no longer this kind of victim of circumstance, but she is agentic, and that's okay, right? She uses her power and agency, and what power and agency she's allowed to have, which is usually through her body. But instead of that being a source of concern, it's a kind of rah-rah feminist go girl narrative, right? So there is a kind of shift in the emphasis on her. But what also happens in that movement to from this sort of second wave and the second wave backlash is we get a lot of post-feminist Anns. And post-feminist Anns, I think, again, are tied up in this knowledge, or this perception that feminism has sort of gone, far enough, and that we live in a post-feminist kind of world, and that therefore she can't blame. Anne is in this position where she can't kind of blame her circumstances, right? So all of Anne's problems are those that she brings about upon herself. And again, the other Boleyn girl is a fabulous example of this, because in the other Boleyn girl, Philippa, 2001, so right in that sort of post-feminist moment, Philippa Gregory suggests that basically all of Anne's problems are that she's basically failed. She's failed to be a good enough woman to keep Henry's attention. She's failed in her wifely duties. She's been too kind of argumentative. She hasn't, sort of shut up and been submissive. And so that is her problem, actually. And we see her failure as leading to her execution. So we strip out that kind of sense that she was a woman in a patriarchal world, and it becomes, well, she should have made better choices, right? Basically, Gregory suggests again that if she had been more like Mary, if she hadn't, answered Henry back or advanced her own kind of opinion, then it would have all gone much easier and better for Anne.
Yes, so that's quite a contrast from the second wave feminist interpretation of Anne. So here, I mean, it's very neoliberal in the sense that everything, it comes down to her individual choice, whereas the second wave feminist representations tended to look more at the structures of the court and all the things that were limiting and constraining those very choices that she could make, right, and how she had to use her sexuality because there were very few other avenues to power available to her as well. So I think it's really fascinating that so many people are still so obsessed with Anne Boleyn today, nearly 500 years after her death in 1536. So much so that, I think just reading your book, what really astonished me was that there's so much young adult fiction, right? Fan fiction written by young women and internet websites devoted to Anne, and not to mention the television and film, representations as well. So, why do you think people are still so obsessed with Anne Boleyn today?
Yeah, I mean, just today there was a new version of Anne Boleyn's story that just premiered on Channel 5 in the UK, starring a Black woman as Anne. And you can imagine how people have responded to that with calm, non-racist rhetoric, I'm sure. So I think that there's a few things going on here. I think that it's a really good story, right? I think it is just a fantastic story. The story of the man who had 6 wives and killed 2 of them. I think there's a perennial appeal. We also love stories about queens, right? Queens are perennially popular because they were some of the few women in, the medieval and the early modern world to have power. And we know other women did have other limited forms of power, but queens had a kind of quite tangible power. So we love stories of queens. The crown is still a huge thing. There also is a soap opera element. There's really familiar kind of contours to Anne's story that I think are really attractive. She's the original other woman. Okay, she's just the sexy other woman who is going to enter into this long-standing marriage and ruin it all. And we love those stories. We love love triangles. We love stories about, affairs and all of this sort of stuff. So there is a kind of soap opera appeal. But also, again, I think there's a lot of gaps in her story. There is a lot of room for imagination. There's a lot of room for different Annes. The fact that, I chose the front cover of my book because she appears to be so different to how we imagine her today. She's, this quite placid little lady. She's, you know, holding a rose, and she's dressed all in lace, and she looks like butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. And, you know, when we compare that to a very kind of sexually forward Anne that we usually get in film and television these days, it's completely different. So I thought I want to put something that people won't expect, so that they can really get the sense that our understanding of Anne is very specific to our particular point in time. Other points in time wouldn't recognise our Anne. Yeah. So the gaps, I think, are really important. In relation to YA fiction, you know, young adult fiction, I think Anne is an attractive figure because YA fiction loves an outsider. It loves a woman who seems to have come up against the odds and succeeded, even though she eventually fell. I think it's a very kind of familiar tale for YA fiction. YA fiction about queens too tends to focus on the fact that, you know, being a princess or being a queen isn't, you know, all that great. There are a lot of stories about, you know, young women being thrown into these kind of courtly situations and not kind of knowing how to deal with them. So it becomes a kind of fish out of water tale. But in terms of
the script for Meghan Markle.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are so many. Look, Meghan Markle got married on the day that she was executed, right, on May the 19th, and she walked right down that aisle over Henry VIII's body in Windsor. So, you know, there are the parallels right themselves. But, you know, there's not just YA fiction. There is Anne Boleyn vampire fiction. There's Anne Boleyn in high school fiction. There's Anne Boleyn as a Hollywood actress fiction. There's Anne Boleyn time travel fiction. There's Anne Boleyn ghosts. There's Anne Boleyn zombies. There is Anne Boleyn lesbian threesome time travel fiction. I'm mentioning that specifically for Tom, who I know loves Anne Boleyn lesbian threesome fiction. So, you know, there are all sorts of as I keep saying to people, the only Anne Boleyn that I haven't seen is Anne Boleyn in space. There is Anne Boleyn. Yeah, I'm sure it's coming. Now that I put that out into the world, it will happen. But yeah, there's just an incredible amount of writing out there on Anne Boleyn. I have discovered things since I published the book that I didn't know existed. There is just, you know, more novels being written every day. There is this new series that just started. There is the musical 6. I've just discovered there's another musical being written called Boleyn, the musical. There is a really inexhaustible mine of just material out there about Anne Boleyn. And of course, she's become the center of a fandom in recent years. So I'm not the only one to have noticed this. There's a bit of writing out there about Anne Boleyn fandom. So there is a really dedicated fandom out there that sort of congregates around Anne Boleyn fan sites, and they have a certain vision of what they believe Anne to have been like in their head. And they, you know, discuss things about elements of a character. They will discuss things like new fictions about her. There was recently a sort of new discovery made about her Book of Hours, and that was, you know, caused a huge kind of I don't know, excitement in the fandom. And, you know, there are lots of women, especially out there, that have really latched on to Anne's story, especially young women. And Mickey Mayhew's thesis, this UK scholar has written a thesis about Anne Boleyn and social media. And he writes that young women who feel disenfranchised latch on to Anne's story because they see her as a woman who was both lauded and punished for her display of femininity. She both got where she was because she was a kind of extremely successful at being a woman. She was sexy, she was smart, all of these sorts of things. But that was actually the root of her downfall as well. So that kind of tension between being the kind of woman that society wants you to be, you know, incredibly beautiful, incredibly feisty, incredibly smart, incredibly talented, all of these sorts of things that women are taught they have to be, is actually why she fell. And the women in her fandom sort of latch onto that essential contradiction because they see that contradiction play out in their own lives. And I think that's quite compelling, actually, as an explanation for why Anne remains so popular. But I mean, every time I talk about my research to people, I just get people coming up and saying, oh my gosh, I've been obsessed with Anne Boleyn since I was a child. You know, the pull of Anne Boleyn is real. There are some external people here that I know who are huge fans of Anne Boleyn and have done some research on Anne Boleyn. So, you know, they are all drawn for those same reasons, because she's such a compelling figure, such a compelling historical actor.
Yeah, and I think, you make the point that there are so many gaps in the stories that we can read so many things into the gaps. But I think equally important is the way in which, when we think about the major plot points of her life or the major events in her life, they are, the plot points are such that they are actually transgeneric. They can fit many different kinds of genres, obviously romance, suspense, thriller, crime, the gothic, as you've mentioned before. So these plot points are actually really transgeneric, and it makes me think a lot, I guess, about what Hayden White has written about emplotment and history, the way we take events and string them all together to make some kind of narrative, right, that is influenced by genre. So, I guess my final question is, what can you tell us about the broader conclusions that you draw from your study about popular representations of the past in media and literature?
Well, I mean, the number one kind of take-home message of all of my work on historical fiction about Anne Boleyn is that Anne Boleyn is whatever we want her to be. Anne Boleyn is whatever we need her to be in a particular time or want her to be, and she just becomes a figure through which to think about women, and particularly through which to think about women's relationship to power and women's relationship to sex. Okay, so whatever kind of pressure point is there in that particular moment in time in relation to sex and power, that's where Anne Boleyn can become a figure through which to think about that. So she becomes, for this 16th, 17th century, they're fighting about religion. So she becomes this figure, this contested religious figure. Nowadays we're, still thinking about women and power. We're still thinking about women and sex. And so she becomes a figure through which to think about those things. So she is just exactly what we want her to be. And that's a lovely quote from my favorite Anne Boleyn fiction is a novel in which she is a teenage girl in high school. And it's, a contemporary novel. It's called The Dead Queen's Club. And she actually does say that. The narrator is a kind of contemporary version of Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife. And Anne of Cleves at one point just says straight out, the story of Anne Boleyn can be whatever the teller wants it to be. That's the message. That's the take-home message of my book, that whatever we need her to be, she is. And I mean, writing the book was a lovely journey through, it became a journey through 500 years of popular fiction, really, for me. And it really demonstrated how in tune popular fiction is with the concerns of the moment, and how popular fiction deploys the past and deploys history in order to really think through whatever is happening in that particular point in time. So I read every kind of popular fiction. She appears in whatever's popular, whatever is the most popular form of the moment, she's there. So, that meant the she tragedies of the Restoration stage. That means now, Anne Boleyn Tudor vampire, right? Or Anne Boleyn high school girl, or Anne Boleyn sexy, sex goddess, whatever the case may be. I'm thinking there of something like the Tudors. So it was a lovely indication at a kind of broader level of how responsive popular fiction is to the conditions of the moment.
Okay, I think we are done. Long live the Queen.
Yes. Long may she reign.
Okay, over to you, Bridget.
Thanks very much, Hsu-Ming. Look, that was a terrific conversation. There is now an opportunity for some questions or comments from the Zoom room, if anyone would like to put their hand up. Now, I think I can see some applause, some nice comments in the chat. I think there's a question from you, Roberta. Roberta, are you there?
Hi. Yes, hello. Sorry, it took me a second to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Dr. Russo, for this. Never been happier to wake up at 6 a.m. for anything else. I'm here with my Anne Boleyn mug. I'm so excited. I also start from a personal journey as a PhD student in beheading, because of discovering Anne Boleyn's story when I was very young. And I was wondering if you could say something about this aspect specifically in the sort of development of the literature of Anne Boleyn, how is the beheading of Anne Boleyn portrayed. Is there any change in which that is portrayed? Does the third person to the first person narration changes that also somehow? So that's my main curiosity, I guess. But thank you so much for this.
Thanks, Roberta. And Roberta is an external person who contacted me on Twitter and was really happy to join this conversation. So thank you so much for coming. In terms of representations of the execution, it's quite interesting actually, because it gets incredibly gory and very strange. I think in earlier texts it's played as grand tragedy. Obviously, it's quite easy to stage it as grand tragedy. You also get a kind of triumphalist sort of sense in her beheading scenes in some of the earlier kind of more religious works, where she's represented as a Protestant martyr, like, I'm going to go and make myself a martyr and people will remember that I died for my religious cause. And, you know, sometimes she prophesies the rise of Elizabeth at her execution. I mean, she had no reason to think that Elizabeth would become queen, but that's sort of a key sort of strand. What's interesting is the 21st century representations, or more recent representations, they're still played in grand kind of tragic mode, but you also get really strange things happen. So for example, Alison Weir, she famously narrates Anne's execution after it happens from the first person. So she's lost her head, but she still narrates. It's incredibly disturbing and unlikely, but she talks about seeing her own headless body. Very strange. So you get more of a sense of a kind of bodily horror, I think, in more 21st century execution scenes. The one that sticks out as being particularly affecting is the scene in the television adaptation of Wolf Hall. I don't particularly love Wolf Hall, and I don't particularly love the adaptation in all respects, but I think that Claire Foy has her uncontrollably trembling as she's about to be executed. And I think that really viscerally emphasizes the absolute terror that she must have felt in those moments. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, it's really fascinating. I was thinking about the Alison Weir. I had a lot of feelings about the narration after that, and Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies. So yeah. Thank you. This is really fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to forget that Alison Weir novel. Very strange.
Yeah.
Thanks, Roberta, and it's so lovely to have you join us. Now, I think there's a question from Intan. Are you able to ask that, Intan, or would you like me to read it out for you?
Oh, hi. Oh, thank you so much. It's really interesting how the different phases of Anne Boleyn result in different genres, from Gothic to horror. And do you think that Anne Boleyn is always linked to contesting ideas of feminism? Would you say that? It seems that the liberal feminist discourse is kind of dominating. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely do. I think that she's always been seen as a lens through which to think about women's experiences, and certainly since feminism has, you know, become a dominant or a contested discourse, she certainly always has been a way of thinking through different ways of understanding feminism. I think that the recent move to make her story more inclusive is interesting. That, you know, we do have quite literally today a new adaptation in which she's played by a Black woman. I mean, I think that's significant at this particular moment in time. I think that they are really picking up on the Meghan Markle links too. You know, the spectacle of a Black queen or Black royalty. So I think, yes, she is a weather vane for whatever is happening in feminist discourse at the moment. But I do agree that liberal feminism and a kind of very neoliberal discourse has underlaid her story in recent years. I do think that there are signs that that's kind of shifting into a more kind of using a kind of more intersectional approach to feminism through her, or manifesting that through her story, through a kind of consideration of her race, of the ways in which she's almost been sort of racially othered throughout her representations, because she is presented as just sort of a such an unusual English woman, a kind of not English woman in some ways. Like, she's been talked about as like more French than English. And there is a lot of kind of carry on about her, you know, dark, swarthy complexion, as opposed to her sisters, you know, English peaches and cream, kind of blonde, blue-eyed complexion. So there is an interesting kind of shift, I think, to thinking about her in terms of more contemporary understandings of feminism.
Thanks, Steph. Now there's a question from Veronica.
Yes, hi. Thank you both so much for that great exchange. And I really loved what you're saying, Steph, about Anne Boleyn as essentially a screen for projection of whatever we're obsessed with or afraid about, or essentially whatever we desire for her as well. Actually reviewing a book on Victorian medievalism more generally right now, and I'm seeing that same pattern play out over and over.
Yeah.
But I have a somewhat specific question about the life writing angle. So from what I understand, life writing, much like travel writing and history writing, and to some extent translation, was often a way for female writers to lay claim to authorial ambition without seeming to trespass too much on traditionally male genres and preserves. Do you see that happening with Anne Boleyn writing? Is it a kind of springboard for women who write about her life, to stake a kind of authorial claim? And then I'm also curious about whether she's generally seen as an icon of feminine virtue or vice in the era in which this life writing by women was proliferating.
Yes, certainly. We do see that, especially in the 19th century, when we do start to get a lot of women writing collective biographies. I'm thinking here about the Strickland sisters, who wrote The Lives of the Queens of England. Elizabeth Benga also writes a biography of Anne Boleyn. And this was, you know, writing biographical history was a kind of softly way of women entering into historical discourse, because they could focus on the personal, they could focus on the emotional, they could focus on the affective as a means of writing history. And so, yes, they're staking a claim to historical writing through life writing. In terms of whether she was personal vice or virtue, it depends on the writer. For somebody like Benga, Benga hates the medieval, actually. She thinks the medieval is a terrible time of, you know, suspicion and, you know, lewdness and unbelievable, you know, fallenness, and I can't believe what those medievals were up to. And so Anne Boleyn brings modernity and brings rationality to England, and so therefore she is an icon of feminine virtue. For somebody like Strickland, she's less convinced, but again, that motif of that I was talking about earlier, of like the personal reformation, that Anne Boleyn was kind of loose and flirty and, you know, liked men and liked attention, but then she becomes queen and she sort of settles down and becomes kind of more aware of the importance of her role and her kind of moral, her role as moral influencer. So yes, it depends on the writer. She can be both, but she's more virtue than vice.
Thanks, Steph. If I could just briefly ask a question myself, you were talking about the racialized othering of Anne Boleyn, and I was wondering if all of the historical fiction that you've traced that has appeared about Anne Boleyn is purely Anglophone, or if there have been any other treatments of her by, for example, Dutch or French or European writers or filmmakers.
Yes, there has been. There's been quite a lot. I had to limit my corpus to Anglophone because my corpus was like 400 novels. So I had to draw a line somewhere in the sand.
Yeah.
And I originally had included French and Spanish writing about Anne Boleyn, but I had to remove it because the book is 120,000 words. It was supposed to be 100. So already I was in big trouble. So yes, there's been quite a lot of French writing about Anne Boleyn. And again, that has got to do with the fact that she did spend a lot of her childhood and adolescence in France. She did live quite a few years in France in the French court. There is some interesting Spanish stuff in the 17th century, where of course she is basically the whore of Babylon because she has destroyed Catholicism, right? So there is quite a lot of interesting Anglophone material. There's also, you know, really interesting stuff, and this one I did sneak in, which was Ernst Lubitsch's silent film, Anne Boleyn, which is in German. And it's the first full-length treatment of Anne Boleyn. It has a really funny scene in which she sort of runs from Henry at one point, like sort of in this sort of silent film kind of comical way, runs away from him. So yes, there is quite a lot of European takes, but I did have to exclude most of them. Yeah.
Thanks, Steph. Is much European work being done on those non-English works?
Yeah, a little bit. There's quite a lot of writing about that Spanish play, and then there's a poem by Lancelot Carles, who actually writes about her execution. But there's a very old 16th, 17th century text. In terms of more recent texts, I'm not aware of anything.
Thank you, Stephanie. Look, I'm conscious of time. I think I should wind up. I want to give Hsu-Ming an opportunity to say something briefly as well, but I might just read out from the comments, one from our ancient history colleague, Lee Burness, saying that the historical Anne Boleyn was essentially unknowable, but a figure who was represented in a rich variety of ways afterwards reminds me very much of ancient Roman women. So look, I would like to thank you both very much for a really wonderful discussion. You've managed to cover so much territory for us in this newish department, and for other people across campus, elsewhere in Australia and also internationally. So thank you so much for this really terrific discussion based on your book, which I know we're going to, those of us who haven't yet read it will be wanting to read it, as well as to see more films and series about Anne Boleyn.